The wind that swept down from the Yeseniki Mountains into the valley of Svebohov was always sharp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a sensory imprint that would remain with Jiří Bezděk for the rest of his life. Born on February 28, 1907 in this small Moravian village near Zábřeh, Jiří entered a world defined by the rhythmic, grueling labor of the soil. His father, a man of few words, divided his existence between a modest plot of farmland and the dark, towering forests where he worked as a longer. It was a life of calloused hands and aching backs, one that Jiří, even as a young boy, observed with a mixture of respect and a burning desire to escape. He was one of 4 children, and in the cramped conditions of their rural cottage, privacy was a luxury unknown. Yet Jiří possessed a quiet intellect that demanded feeding. He completed the 2-grade elementary school in Svebohov with ease, his hunger for knowledge propelling him to the town school in nearby Zábřeh. The daily walk was long, often through mud or snow, but it was a path towards something greater than the forest work that awaited most boys of his station. Upon finishing school, however, the economic reality of the region caught up with him. There were no grand opportunities for a poor farmer's son, and for a time he drifted through odd jobs, supporting himself with whatever manual labor was available, feeling the stagnation of village life closing in around him. At 18, seeking structure and a ticket out of the mundane, he voluntarily enlisted in the Czechoslovak army. It was 1925, and the young republic was still forging its identity. Jiří was assigned to the 27th Infantry Regiment, stationed in the historic city of Olomouc. The military offered discipline, but Olomouc offered something far more dangerous and intoxicating: ideas. The city was a hub of intellectual activity, and during his off hours, the young soldier did not frequent taverns, but instead found his way to a teacher's institute, privately attending lectures. He was trying to mold himself into an educator, a man of letters rather than a man of the axe. He left the army in 1926 with the rank of sergeant, a disciplined young man with a broadened horizon. That same year, swept up in the fervor of the times and the promises of social justice that echoed through the working classes, he joined the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, KSCH. To Jiří and many like him, the red flag represented not tyranny, but a scientifically organized hope, a way to lift men like his father out of the dirt. Fate, however, arrived in the form of a letter from an acquaintance, the evangelical vicar Rudolf Štědý of the Kosnická Jednota Association. Štědý spoke of the Czech expatriate villages deep within the Soviet Union, communities that had maintained their language and culture but were in desperate need of teachers. It was an offer that appealed to every facet of Jiří's character, his teaching ambitions, his communist idealism, and his adventurous spirit. He accepted. In October 1927, Jiří Bezděk arrived in the Soviet Union. He was assigned to the Czech school in the village of Vyšehrad. Initially, it seemed as though he had found his paradise. The steppes were vast, the soil rich, and the community welcomed him with open arms. He threw himself into his work, teaching the children of farmers who spoke a dialect of his own tongue. A year into his stay, his integration seemed complete. He married Helena Yandova, a local girl from a Czech family. Deepening his commitment to the cause, and still a true believer in the Bolshevik experiment, he joined the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks. He saw himself as a bridge between his homeland and the new socialist utopia.
But the utopia was a mirage that began to shimmer and dissolve as the 1920s bled into the 1930s. The atmosphere in Ukraine shifted from revolutionary optimism to paranoid dread. Stalin's collectivization policies began to tear at the fabric of the agrarian society. The pressure on the Czech minority villages intensified. What had once been viewed as a model of international cooperation was now viewed by the OGPU, the secret police, as a nest of spies. By the end of the 1920s, the first arrests began. Teachers, intellectuals, and community leaders were disappearing in the night, accused of collaborating with the religious fascist organization Kostnica Nedyota. The borders sealed tight, contacts with Czechoslovakia were severed. The silence from home was deafening. Jiří Bezděk tried to keep his head down, focusing on his wife and his newborn child. On July 7, 1930, Helena gave birth to their first child. For 11 days, Jiří allowed himself to feel joy, a fragile emotion in a time of terror. But the machinery of the state had already marked him. On July 18, 1930, while traveling to Kyiv, likely to handle administrative matters or secure supplies, Jiří was arrested. The transition from free man to prisoner was brutal and instantaneous. He was thrown into the OGPU prison in Kyiv, a place where the walls were thick enough to stifle screams. He was not alone. 41 other prominent Czechs, teachers, association leaders, successful farmers, were dragged into the net. For weeks, they were subjected to the Soviet method of investigation: sleep deprivation, beatings, and endless circular interrogations designed to manufacture truth rather than discover it. On August 25th, the prisoners were moved like cattle to Kharkiv. The change of venue brought no relief, only an intensification of the process. Day after day, until March 1931, Jiří was grilled by interrogators who cared nothing for his Communist Party membership or his dedication to the Soviet state. They needed a conspiracy, and Jiří was to be a principal actor in it. The final indictment was a masterpiece of fabrication, accusing the group of espionage, counter-revolutionary activities in favor of Czechoslovakia and France, agitation against the government, and, ironically for a communist, religious agitation. The show trial was held from June 12th to June 14th, 1931, in the theater hall of the OGPU Club in Kharkiv. It was a piece of grim theater. The extraordinary session of the Supreme Court of the USSR delivered its verdict with mechanical coldness. 10 defendants, Jiří Bezděk among them, were sentenced to death by shooting. The gavel fell, and the silence that followed was absolute. From the courtroom, the condemned men were returned to solitary confinement in the Kharkiv prison, left to wait for the executioner's footsteps. Each rattle of the keys, each heavy door opening, sent a jolt of primal fear through Jiří's body. But the bullet did not come. Instead, a Kafkaesque reprieve occurred. They were transferred to the prison for political prisoners in Yaroslavl. The death sentence hung over him like a suspended blade, unexecuted but unrevoked, while the regime decided his ultimate utility.
It was in the isolation of Yaroslavl that the true torture began. It was not physical pain, but the agony of news from the outside. Through the clandestine whispers of the prison network, Jiří learned that his world had collapsed. His wife, Helena, unable to bear the stigma of being an enemy of the people's wife and facing the crushing weight of the state, had left him. Worse, the famine, the Holodomor that was ravaging Ukraine, had claimed his child. The son he had held for only 11 days had starved to death. In the dark dampness of his cell, Jiří Bezděk broke. The ideology he had served had not only imprisoned him, but had murdered his blood. After 2.5 years of rotting in Yaroslavl, on August 25, 1933, he was moved again. This time, the destination was the edge of the world, the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea. The former monastery, now a brutal corrective labor camp, was the crown jewel of the Gulag system. But the journey there finally shattered Jiří's mind. The cumulative trauma, the death sentence, the loss of his family, the betrayal of his beliefs, induced a psychotic break. He went temporarily insane, hallucinating, screaming into the void, his mind retreating into a labyrinth where the OGPU could not reach him.
Upon arrival at Solovetsky, he was assigned to the 8th section of the White Sea-Baltic Canal project near the former Savatyevo Hermitage. It was slave labor in its purest form. Men dug the frozen earth with pickaxes, died of exhaustion, and were buried in the foundations of the canal. Bezděk, battling his own madness, which lasted until July 1934, worked like an automaton. He was a shell of a man, driven only by a flicker of biological survival instinct. The harsh winds of the White Sea bit into his skin, mirroring the coldness in his soul. Yet the capricious Soviet system had one more twist. On July 18, 1935, exactly 5 years to the day of his arrest, Jiří was summoned. He expected execution or a transfer to a worse hell. Instead, he was informed that his death sentence had been formally commuted and reduced to 5 years in prison and 5 years in exile. Since he had served the 5 years of imprisonment, he was to be processed for exile immediately. It was a miracle of bureaucracy. 3 days later, he boarded a transport, leaving the nightmare of the islands behind. But the journey to exile was an odyssey in itself. He was moved by train to Murmansk, held in a transit camp, and then shunted through a vast geographic arc: Petrozavodsk, Leningrad, Vologda, Vyatka, Perm, Sverdlovsk. In Tyume, a moment of lucid daring saved his future. He managed to secretly smuggle a letter to the Polish Red Cross in Moscow. It was a bottle cast into the ocean, but it was found. The Polish Red Cross informed the Czechoslovak authorities and, crucially, Jiří's aging parents in Moravia that their son was alive. From Tyume, the deportation continued via Omsk to Krasnoyarsk. In early September 1935, Jiří Bezděk and 80 other wretches were loaded on a steamer on the Yenisei River. They traveled north, the landscape becoming wilder, the settlements fewer. They disembarked at Strelka, where the Angara meets the Yenisei, and were transferred to small boats towed by a tug. Finally, in the town of Kejma, the guards left him. He was technically free, but it was the freedom of the castaway. He continued in a small boat with an Evenk guide and several native women, navigating the treacherous waters until on October 9, 1935, he arrived in the remote village of Selingino.
Selingino was a cluster of huts in the taiga, forgotten by time. The locals, hardened by their own struggle for survival, did not welcome the ragged foreigner. They saw another mouth to feed, a stranger with strange eyes. The winter of 1935 was a crucible. Bezděk, the former teacher and soldier, was reduced to a beggar. He went from hut to hut, offering to chop wood, to clean, to do anything for a crust of bread or a bowl of fish soup. He slept in drafty corners, wrapping himself in rags, the cold gnawing at his bones. It was only when the fishing season began at the end of the year that the grip of hunger loosened. He proved his worth on the river, and the local Evenk slowly ceased to view him as an intruder, accepting him as a fellow survivor. He expected to die there, or at best, to live out his days in obscurity. But the letter he had sent from Tyumen had worked its way through diplomatic channels. The Czechoslovak government, protective of its citizens, had made inquiries. On August 20, 1936, a localized miracle occurred. Bezděk received permission to return to Czechoslovakia. The journey home was a blur of rivers and rails, a month traveling back up the Angara and Yenisei, then the endless Trans-Siberian Railway, and finally the crossing into Central Europe. On September 20, 1936, he stepped onto the platform in his homeland. He returned to Svabohov, to the parents who had mourned him as dead. Physically, he was back in the rolling hills of Moravia, but mentally, Jiří Bezděk was scarred beyond recognition. He tried to reintegrate. He looked for teaching jobs, but he was a man with a gap in his life, a former communist who had seen the face of the Gorgon. The local schools in Zabrze had no place for him. Restless and needing anonymity, he moved to Prague. He found work as a contract clerk at the state statistical office. It was dry, numerical work, safe and devoid of politics. In the evenings, however, he poured his trauma onto paper, engaging in publishing activities. His theme was singular, the reality of the USSR. He wrote of the prisons, the hunger and the lies, trying to warn a populace that still looked east with romantic idealism. In March 1939, the Nazis marched into Prague. The occupation began, but initially it touched Jiří lightly. He was a clerk, a cog in the bureaucratic machine, and he kept his head down. But the war had a way of finding him. When the Nazi campaign in Russia faltered after 1941, the Nazi propaganda machine shifted gears. They needed to terrify the Czech population with the threat of Bolshevik hordes. They needed someone who knew the truth about the USSR. On August 1, 1944, by decision of the Nazi authorities, Bezděk was forcibly transferred from the statistical office to the Kuratorium, the Public Enlightenment Service. It was a devil's bargain. He was appointed head of the 5th Department for Statistics in the district office. His task was to travel to Czech cities and lecture workers about his experiences in the USSR. For Jiří, this was a moment of profound moral complexity. He was speaking the truth. He despised the Soviet system that had killed his son and stolen his sanity. But he was speaking it on behalf of the Nazis, a regime he held in equal contempt. He walked this razor's edge until May 1945, telling horror stories of the Gulag to audiences that listened with mixed fear and skepticism.
When the liberation came, in May 1945, the nuance of his position was lost in the wave of retribution. To the victors, he was a man who had lectured for the Nazis. He was arrested on May 29, 1945, during the chaotic purge of collaborators. For months, he sat in Pankratz prison, investigated for treason. It was a bitter irony. The Soviets had imprisoned him for being a Czech spy. Now the Czechs imprisoned him for being a Nazi mouthpiece. However, the facts of his life were stubborn. He had not denounced anyone. He had not worn a uniform. He had merely recounted his actual suffering. He was released from custody in October 1945, though the investigation lingered like a dark cloud until mid-1946, when he was definitively acquitted. By then, he had already begun to rebuild, finding work as a teacher at a vocational school at the Pluto mine in Luka u Litvinova. For a brief period, it seemed Jiří might finally find peace. His intelligence and organizational skills were undeniable. At the end of 1946, he was appointed head of education for mining apprentices at the North Bohemian coal mines in Most. 4 years later, he rose to head the department of the Łącka Akcja, a major labor recruitment drive. But the political winds were shifting again. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia had seized total power in 1948, and the atmosphere began to mirror the Soviet Union of the 1930s. Class struggle, paranoia, and the search for saboteurs became the order of the day. Bezděk, with his history of imprisonment in the USSR and his wartime lectures exposing Soviet crimes, was a marked man. He lasted in his leadership position only until June 1951, when he was dismissed for political reasons, thinly veiled as poor performance. Stripped of his status, he was forced to work as an unskilled laborer at the national enterprise Průmysl in Most. The final blow fell on January 28, 1952, as the communist regime staged show trials to purge the mining industry of bourgeois experts. Jiří Bezděk was arrested at his workplace. The script was terrifyingly familiar. He was taken to the detention prison in Litoměřice. The investigation lasted months. The charge was sabotage, the catch-all accusation for economic failures in a planned economy. The trial of Adolf Winkler and Company, in which Bezděk was a defendant, took place from November 16 to 18, 1953, at the regional court in Ústí nad Labem. There was no justice here, only a predetermined outcome dictated by the party.
All accused were found guilty. Jiří Bezděk was sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment. It was a sentence meant to ensure he would never breathe free air again. He was sent to the fortress prison of Mirov, a medieval castle turned dungeon. For years he languished there, his health deteriorating, his spirit tested once more. He wrote letters, requested reviews, and shouted his innocence from his cell, but the regime was deaf. It wasn't until the political thaw of the 1960s that the ice cracked. On May 9, 1960, under a broad amnesty by President Antonian Novotny, Jiří Bezděk was released from Mirov. He emerged from Mirov a broken man, aged far beyond his 53 years. He lived briefly with his former family in Litvinov, an awkward, painful arrangement, before moving to Yablonets nad Nisou. There he found employment in the SVED cooperative making costume jewelry. It was delicate work for hands that dug the White Sea Canal and mined coal, but he did it with quiet resignation. His body, however, could not forget the years of malnutrition, freezing temperatures, and torture. In 1967, his health collapsed completely, and he was hospitalized in a sanatorium in Kremizh near Teplitz. As he lay in his hospital bed in the summer of 1968, the news from the outside world filtered in. The Prague Spring was blooming. There was hope for socialism with a human face. Perhaps Jiří allowed himself a moment of optimism. But on August 21, 1968, the tanks rolled in. The armies of the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the reform movement. The very power that had arrested him in 1930, that had killed his son and broken his mind, had now conquered his homeland. Jiří Bezděk lingered for a few more weeks, listening to the sounds of occupation. He died on September 16, 1968. His life was a tragic circle, beginning and ending in the shadow of the same totalitarian colossus, a witness to the century's darkest hours, who was never granted the peace of forgetting.